The morning fog rolled thick across Long Island Sound in the summer of 1902, wrapping itself around a construction site that seemed to defy reason and physics in equal measure. Through the mist, workers could make out the skeleton of something impossible, a French chateau rising from American soil, 6 stories of limestone and marble climbing toward the sky as if trying to escape the very ground it stood on. The architect had told them this would be the greatest house ever built in America. The owner had told them money was no object, and standing there in the pre-dawn cold, watching steam rise from their coffee cups while they waited for the sun to burn away the fog, those workers believed both statements completely. Harbor Hill was being near, and with it, the template for every American mansion that would follow, the model for every Gilded Age fantasy, the inspiration for a novel that would define an entire era. Because this house, this impossible, beautiful, tragic house, would become the real-world Great Gatsby mansion, the place that gave F. Scott Fitzgerald his vision of wealth so extreme it became its own kind of prison. But in 1902, none of that had happened yet. In 1902, Harbor Hill was just a dream being hammered into reality by men who earned $3 a day while building a home that would cost 600 workers 3 full years to complete. The man behind this dream was Clarence Hungerford Mackay, heir to one of the largest fortunes in American history, a fortune built on silver and telegraph wires, and the backs of miners who died by the thousands in western mountains while Clarence grew up in palaces. He was 30 years old when construction began, newly in control of his inheritance after his father's death, and desperate to prove something that wealthy sons have been trying to prove since wealth was invented, that he deserved what he had been given, that he was more than just lucky genetics, that he could take the money his father had extracted from the earth and transform it into something beautiful, something cultured, something that would make people forget the violence and exploitation that had generated his fortune in the first place. Harbor Hill would be his proof, his monument, his transformation from the son of a rough mining baron into an American aristocrat worthy of respect from European nobility. He would build the finest house in America, fill it with art that would make museums jealous, and marry a woman so beautiful that other men would understand his worth simply by seeing her on his arm. The plan was perfect, the execution would be flawless, and absolutely nothing would go the way he imagined. If stories that refuse to simplify wealth into fairy tales matter to you, stories that take months to uncover because the real version is always more complicated than the legend, then your presence here is what allows this work to continue. Clarence's father, John William Mackay, had been born in Dublin in 1831 and immigrated to America as a child, arriving with nothing, speaking English with an accent that marked him as foreign and inferior. He worked his way west during the California gold rush, not finding gold himself, but learning how mining worked, how fortunes were made not by the men swinging pickaxes, but by the men who owned the claims and controlled the ore. He moved to Nevada when silver was discovered in the Comstock lode, and there he made his move. Through a combination of shrewd investment, ruthless competition, and partnerships with other ambitious men, John William gained control of several of the richest silver mines in American history. The Comstock lode produced over $300 million in silver and gold during its peak years, equivalent to roughly $9 billion today when adjusted for inflation and purchasing power. John William Mackay controlled a significant percentage of that output, and the wealth flowed into his accounts like an unstoppable river. By the 1870s, he was one of the richest men in America, generating the equivalent of tens of millions annually just from his mining interests. He diversified into communications, founding the commercial cable company that laid telegraph cables across the Atlantic Ocean, breaking the monopoly that had allowed other companies to charge excessive rates for international messages. The cable company alone was worth over $100 million, nearly $3 billion in today's money. John William understood where his money came from. He had worked in the mines himself as a young man. He knew the conditions, the heat, the danger, the certainty that a significant percentage of miners would die from cave-ins or falls or simple exhaustion. He knew the labor camps were brutal places where men lived in squalor while producing wealth they would never share. He knew, and he considered it the natural order of things. Some men owned, some men worked. The world had always functioned this way, and his success proved he belonged in the ownership class regardless of where he had started. But John William also understood that his rough origins marked him, that the Protestant establishment of New York and Boston and Philadelphia would never fully accept a Irish immigrant who had made his fortune in mining camps and speculative investments. So he did what ambitious immigrants have always done. He invested in his children. He sent Clarence to the finest schools, hired tutors to eliminate any trace of Irish working class culture from the boy's accent and manners, moved the family to Paris during Clarence's teenage years so the boy could absorb European culture and learn to move comfortably among aristocrats. The plan was that Clarence would complete the transformation John William had started. The son would be what the father could never be, a gentleman, refined, cultured, accepted. Clarence absorbed these lessons completely, perhaps too completely. He grew up understanding that his worth was tied to his ability to perform sophistication, to demonstrate that the Mackay fortune was more than just money extracted from mountains. He studied art and architecture. He learned to speak French fluently. He attended operas and ballets and cultivated friendships with European nobility who tolerated his presence because his family's money was useful for maintaining their own declining estates. By the time John William died in 1902, leaving Clarence an inheritance worth approximately $250 million in today's dollars, Clarence had become exactly what his father wanted, a wealthy man who no longer looked or sounded like his wealth was new. But Clarence had also become something his father had not intended, a man who believed that spending money on beautiful things was not just acceptable, but noble, that commissioning art and building palaces and hosting elaborate parties was not self-indulgence but cultural contribution, that he could earn respect not through business acumen or hard work, but through taste and generosity and the creation of beauty. This belief would define everything that followed. It would inspire Harbor Hill. It would lead to extraordinary artistic achievements, and it would eventually consume the entire fortune his father had built. The site Clarence chose for his palace was perfect in its symbolism and its practical advantages. Roslyn, Long Island, was close enough to Manhattan to maintain business and social connections, but far enough to create the illusion of rural escape. The land sat on high ground with views of Long Island Sound, allowing the house to be seen from miles away, a beacon of wealth visible to anyone sailing past or traveling through the area. The property encompassed 650 acres, large enough to include formal gardens, working farms, private roads, and all the infrastructure needed to create a self-contained world separate from the ordinary reality most people inhabited. Clarence hired Stanford White, the most famous architect in America, to design the house. White had designed Madison Square Garden. He had built mansions for Vanderbilts and Astors. He understood what Clarence wanted because he had built it before. A house that looked like it had been transported intact from the Loire Valley, that suggested centuries of aristocratic breeding rather than decades of mining wealth. The design White created was based on the Château de Maison Lafitte near Paris, a 17th century masterpiece of French classical architecture. Harbor Hill would replicate that grandeur in American limestone, creating a building so authentically European that visitors would forget they were on Long Island. The scale was staggering, even by Gilded Age standards. The main house alone contained over 200 rooms spread across 190,000 square feet, larger than most museums, larger than many European palaces that had been built over centuries by royal families. The construction required limestone, quarried specifically for the project, marble imported from Italy, hardwoods shipped from Europe and South America. 600 workers labored for 3 years to complete just the structural shell. The interior finishing would take 2 additional years and require craftsmen brought from Europe. Italian plasterers who specialized in ornamental ceilings, French cabinet makers who created custom woodwork for every room, English stonemasons who carved fireplaces large enough to roast entire animals. The budget Clarence set for construction and furnishing was essentially unlimited. Stanford White estimated the project would cost around $5 million, approximately $150 million today. Clarence agreed without negotiation. The actual costs would eventually exceed $8 million, nearly $250 million in current dollars, and Clarence paid every invoice without complaint, because Harbor Hill was not just a house, it was a statement, a declaration that the Mackay family had transcended their origins and joined the permanent aristocracy, that they belonged among the Vanderbilts and Rockefellers and European nobility, not through luck but through refinement and taste. But before we continue with the beauty, pause and ask yourself, how many invisible lives does it take to build one visible monument? The 600 workers who built Harbor Hill were mostly immigrants themselves, men who had fled poverty in Italy, Ireland, Poland, Greece, following the same desperate hope that had brought Clarence's father to America. They earned between $2 and $5 per day, depending on their skill level, roughly $60 to $150 in today's money. They worked 10-hour days, 6 days per week. They lived in temporary housing near the construction site, crude barracks where 20 men shared a single room, sleeping in bunk beds stacked 3 high, cooking meals over shared stoves, trying to save enough money to bring their families from the old country or to move into slightly better accommodations in nearby towns. One of these men was Giovanni Russo, a stone carver from Naples who had studied classical sculpture in Italy before economic desperation drove him to America. He was hired specifically for Harbor Hill because of his skill at creating decorative architectural elements, the carved limestone garlands that would frame windows, the elaborate cornices that would top doorways, the heraldic shields that would be mounted above the main entrance. Giovanni earned $5 per day, the highest wage on the construction site because his skills were rare and essential. He worked on Harbor Hill for all 3 years of main construction, carving details that most visitors would never look at closely, but that gave the house its appearance of authentic European craftsmanship. Giovanni lived in the workers' barracks, saving 4 out of every $5 he earned. His wife and 3 children were still in Naples, waiting for him to save enough for their passage to America, approximately $300 total, representing months of brutal saving. He calculated that if he could work on Harbor Hill for 3 full years and avoid any injuries or illnesses that would interrupt his income, he would have enough saved to bring his family over and perhaps even to open a small stone carving business, serving the many wealthy estates being built across Long Island. He worked for 2 years and 7 months. Then a pulley system failed while workers were lifting a 2-ton limestone block to the 4th floor. The block fell. Giovanni was working below. The limestone crushed his legs and pelvis. He died 3 days later from internal bleeding and infection, screaming in a language most of the other workers did not understand. He had saved $210, not enough to bring his family to America, not enough to do anything except get sent back to Naples in a box while his wife tried to figure out how to survive in a country with no safety net and no husband. Giovanni's death was recorded in construction logs as an industrial accident, one of dozens that occurred during Harbor Hill's construction. There was no compensation paid to his widow, no acknowledgement that a man had died building someone else's palace. The construction continued without pause because stopping would cost money and delay the completion date, and Clarence was eager to move into his finished house and begin the next phase of his plan, filling it with the finest art collection in America and hosting the parties that would cement his position in society. The house that rose from Giovanni's labor and the labor of hundreds like him was, by every objective measure, spectacular. The facade was pure French classical design, 3 stories of limestone with a slate roof punctuated by dormer windows and chimneys. The main entrance featured a porte-cochere, where carriages could drop guests under cover, protecting them from weather as they entered the house. The grand staircase was modeled after the one at Versailles, rising through 3 floors with an iron railing so delicately worked it looked like frozen lace. The ballroom could accommodate 400 guests beneath a ceiling covered in gold leaf and painted with scenes from classical mythology. There was a music room with acoustics designed to rival concert halls, a library to house 30,000 books, a dining room with a table that could seat 60 people, a private chapel with stained glass windows imported from a medieval French church that had been demolished. But the house was just the beginning. Clarence understood that great estates required great art collections, and he set about acquiring one with the same unlimited budget he had applied to construction. He purchased paintings by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Van Dyck, Gainsborough. He acquired sculptures by Michelangelo and Bernini, works that would have been centerpieces in major museums, but that Clarence displayed in his private residence. He bought medieval tapestries that had once hung in European castles, Chinese porcelains from the Ming Dynasty, Persian rugs woven by hand over decades. The art collection alone was valued at over $20 million, approximately 600 million in today's money. Harbor Hill was not just a house. It was a private museum that happened to have bedrooms. The operating costs of maintaining this palace were crushing by any normal standard. Clarence employed over 100 staff year-round: butlers, footmen, housemaids, cooks, laundresses, valets, gardeners, groundskeepers, stable workers, chauffeurs, private secretaries. The annual payroll exceeded $300,000, roughly 9 million today. Add to that the cost of food for family and staff, of maintaining the art collection, of heating and lighting a 190,000 square foot building, of keeping the gardens perfect, of running the private power plant that generated electricity for the estate. The total operating costs exceeded $500,000 annually, 15 million in current money. Clarence was spending the equivalent of over $40,000 every single day just to keep Harbor Hill functioning, just to maintain the stage set on which he performed the role of aristocrat. But he could afford it, at least initially. His inheritance generated income through mining royalties, cable company dividends, and real estate investments. The fortune his father had built was so large that even Clarence's extraordinary spending could not immediately deplete it. And Clarence believed, genuinely believed, that he was using the money well, that by commissioning art and employing craftsmen and hosting cultural events at Harbor Hill, he was contributing to American civilization, that he was not just spending, but investing in beauty and culture that would outlast him. In 1898, before Harbor Hill was even completed, Clarence had married Catherine Dewar, a woman whose beauty was so striking that newspapers described her in terms usually reserved for actresses or mythological figures. Catherine was from an old New York family, not enormously wealthy, but impeccably connected, exactly the kind of social credential Clarence needed to complete his transformation. She was also intelligent, charming, and genuinely interested in the arts and culture that Clarence valued. The marriage seemed perfect, a union of new money and old lineage that would benefit both parties. Catherine became the mistress of Harbor Hill when the house was finally completed in 1905, and she threw herself into the role with energy and intelligence. She hosted concerts featuring world-famous musicians. She organized exhibitions of the art collection, inviting scholars and critics to view works that would normally require traveling to European museums. She created a salon culture at Harbor Hill, gathering writers, artists, intellectuals, and socialites for dinners and discussions that were covered extensively in society pages. Harbor Hill became not just a house, but a cultural institution, the place where New York's elite came to see and be seen, to network and negotiate the social and financial arrangements that define their world. If you are still here following this story through its beauty and complications, you understand this is more than nostalgia. That understanding is what allows deeper examination to continue. For nearly 2 decades, Harbor Hill functioned exactly as Clarence had envisioned. It was the crown jewel of Long Island's Gold Coast, the standard against which all other estates were measured. The parties were legendary. The art collection grew. Clarence's social position seemed secure. He had accomplished what his father had wanted. He had transformed mining wealth into cultural capital, had made the Mackay name synonymous with refinement rather than extraction. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The first crack was financial. Clarence's income, while substantial, was not keeping pace with his spending. The mining operations that had generated his father's fortune were declining as the richest ore was exhausted. The cable company faced increasing competition as newer technologies emerged. Clarence's investment strategy was conservative to the point of passivity. He had inherited a portfolio and largely left it alone, neither growing it aggressively nor adapting to changing economic conditions. Meanwhile, his spending continued at the same extraordinary rate year after year. By 1910, Clarence's annual spending exceeded his annual income by a significant margin. He was not yet in financial trouble. His capital base was still enormous, but he was beginning to erode the principal rather than living off the returns. This is the classic mistake of inherited wealth, assuming that because the money seems infinite, it will last forever without active management. Clarence was too focused on Harbor Hill and his art collection and his social position to notice that he was slowly consuming the fortune that had seemed unconquerable. The second crack was personal. Catherine was growing restless. She had enjoyed playing Mistress of Harbor Hill initially, but the role was becoming repetitive and confining. The same parties, the same people, the same conversations about art and society, while real changes were happening in the world beyond their gates. Women were fighting for the right to vote. Labor movements were challenging the power of industrialists. The world was shifting, and Catherine felt herself trapped in a beautiful cage, performing a role that was increasingly disconnected from any meaningful reality. In 1914, Catherine met Dr. Joseph Blake, a prominent surgeon who moved in the same social circles but came from a professional background rather than inherited wealth. Blake was brilliant, accomplished on his own merits rather than through family connections. He represented something Catherine had not experienced in her marriage to Clarence, a sense that achievement and worth could be earned rather than purchased. They began an affair that was shockingly indiscreet by the standards of the era, meeting openly, allowing themselves to be seen together in ways that sparked immediate gossip. When Clarence discovered the affair, his world collapsed, not just because his wife had been unfaithful. Infidelity was common enough among the wealthy, usually handled through quiet arrangements and maintained appearances, but because Catherine refused to be quiet about it. She wanted a divorce. She wanted to marry Blake. She was willing to endure the scandal and social consequences because she believed her life with Blake would be more meaningful than her life as mistress of Harbor Hill. The divorce, finalized in 1916, was sensational. Newspapers covered every detail. Catherine was granted custody of their 3 children and an enormous financial settlement, several $1 million, plus ongoing support payments that would consume a significant portion of Clarence's annual income indefinitely. The social humiliation was total. The woman Clarence had married to complete his social ascension had publicly rejected him, choosing a surgeon over a palace. The rejection struck at the core of Clarence's identity, at his belief that wealth and culture and refinement were supremely valuable. Catherine had chosen earned achievement over inherited fortune, and in doing so, she had revealed the fundamental emptiness of the life Clarence had built. Clarence retreated into Harbor Hill after the divorce, and the house that had been designed to showcase his success became instead a monument to his failure. The parties continued but felt hollow. The art collection remained spectacular, but no longer drew the crowds Catherine had attracted. Clarence was still enormously wealthy by any normal measure, still living in one of the finest houses in America, still in possession of treasures most people would never see. But the performance had lost its audience. The validation he had been seeking, The sense that his wealth and taste made him worthy of respect had evaporated when Catherine chose someone else. And then came the financial collapse. The Great Depression hit in 1929, and the economic devastation was total and merciless. The stock market crash destroyed approximately 30% of Clarence's remaining wealth in a matter of weeks. His mining investments became nearly worthless as commodity prices collapsed and demand vanished. The cable company's value plummeted as businesses cut communication expenses, and the company's aging infrastructure required capital investments Clarence could not afford. Within 2 years, Clarence's fortune had shrunk by over 60%. He was still wealthy by Depression standards, but he was no longer wealthy enough to maintain Harbor Hill at its previous scale. The staff was cut from over 100 to fewer than 30. Rooms were closed off to save on heating costs. The gardens, which had required constant care from a dozen full-time gardeners, began to grow wild. Sections of the art collection were quietly sold through private dealers to generate liquidity, though Clarence tried to keep these sales secret to avoid admitting his financial difficulties publicly. The operating costs that had seemed manageable when he had a fortune of 250 million became crushing when that fortune had shrunk to under 50 million and was still declining. Clarence died in 1938 at age 65, and his death revealed the extent of his financial collapse. The estate was insolvent. The debts exceeded the remaining assets when the costs of the divorce settlement, the operating losses from Harbor Hill, and the Depression's devastation were fully accounted for. His children inherited not generational wealth, but generational debt. They inherited Harbor Hill, but Harbor Hill was no longer an asset. It was an anchor, a massive property that cost hundreds of thousands annually to operate and that no one wanted to buy during a depression when wealthy families were dumping estates at any price they could get. The house sat empty for several years, while the family tried desperately to find a buyer or a use for it. Every year it sat empty. It deteriorated further. Roofs leaked, pipes froze and burst. Vandals broke in and stole decorative elements they could sell for scrap. The art collection that remained was moved to secure storage, but the house itself was impossible to protect. Without spending money the family no longer had. In 1947, nearly a decade after Clarence's death, the family finally found a buyer, but not for the house as a residence. A developer purchased the property to demolish Harbor Hill and subdivide the land for suburban housing development. The demolition began in 1947 and took months to complete. The limestone that had been quarried specifically for this project was broken into rubble. The marble staircases were jackhammered into pieces. The ornate plasterwork that Italian craftsmen had spent years creating was destroyed in days. The ballroom where Catherine had hosted 400 guests was reduced to a pile of broken materials. Everything Giovanni Russo had died building was erased. Everything Clarence had believed would be his permanent legacy was ground into dust and hauled away in trucks. If you have stayed through this entire arc, through the beauty and the collapse and the erasure, you understand that these stories matter beyond their dramatic elements. That attention is what makes continuing this difficult work possible. The land where Harbor Hill stood is now occupied by suburban houses worth perhaps $500,000 each. Normal houses, nice houses, houses where families live ordinary lives with absolutely no idea that they are living on top of what was once the greatest private residence in America. There is no marker, no plaque, nothing to indicate that a palace once stood here, that Giovanni Russo died here, that Catherine Duer hosted concerts here, that Clarence Mackay poured his entire identity into creating something that would outlast him and instead lasted barely 4 decades. But Harbor Hill's influence outlasted the physical structure, because in the early 1920s, a young writer named F. Scott Fitzgerald lived on Long Island's Gold Coast while writing his masterpiece. Fitzgerald attended parties at estates similar to Harbor Hill. He observed the casual cruelty of extreme wealth, the way it created beautiful surfaces that hid emptiness and desperation. He watched wealthy men perform sophistication while their fortunes slowly evaporated. He saw women trapped in gilded cages, married to money rather than to people. And he wrote The Great Gatsby, a novel that captured everything Harbor Hill represented: the beauty, the ambition, the tragedy, the inevitable collapse. Gatsby's mansion in the novel is widely believed to have been inspired by Harbor Hill and similar estates, Fitzgerald observed. The elaborate parties that no one truly enjoys, the desperate attempt to win back a lost love through displays of wealth, the fundamental misunderstanding that money can buy belonging or repair the past, the tragic ending where all the accumulated wealth and beauty prove worthless in the face of human frailty and moral emptiness. Gatsby is Clarence Mackay, translated into fiction, a man who believed he could purchase legitimacy and discovered too late that what he was purchasing was just a more elaborate form of loneliness. The Great Gatsby has sold over 30 million copies. It is taught in schools across America. It has been adapted into multiple films. It has shaped how generations of Americans understand wealth and ambition and the American dream's dark underside. Harbor Hill is gone. Clarence is forgotten by everyone except specialists in Gilded Age history, but the psychological truth Fitzgerald extracted from watching men like Clarence build palaces on Long Island has become immortal in ways Clarence's actual palace never could. There is a bitter irony here. Clarence spent a fortune trying to create a permanent legacy, trying to build something that would make his name meaningful. He failed completely. The house was demolished. The art collection was scattered. His name survives only in specialized histories of telecommunications and mining. But the novelist who watched him and saw through him, who captured the emptiness behind the beauty, that man created something that truly will last, not through wealth, but through understanding, not through building, but through revealing what the buildings were hiding. The workers who built Harbor Hill left an even more invisible legacy. Giovanni Russo's name appears in construction records held in archives that almost no one consults. Margaret Sullivan and the other household staff are recorded in payroll ledgers, but nowhere else. The hundreds of men who labored for years to create Clarence's palace are remembered not at all, except as anonymous labor, interchangeable parts in a machine that produced beauty for someone else to enjoy. They built something magnificent, and it was destroyed, and they died before seeing either the completion or the demolition. Their labor was consumed as completely as Clarence's fortune was consumed, converted into a brief moment of splendor that left no trace except in the memories of people who attended parties they could never have been invited to. What remains of Harbor Hill now is mostly photographs and floor plans held in historical archives, images of the grand staircase that no longer exists, blueprints of rooms that were demolished 70 years ago, documentation of a building that was designed to be permanent and lasted barely 4 decades. These photographs are haunting because they show something that was absolutely real and is now absolutely gone. The limestone was real. The marble was real. Giovanni's labor was real. Clarence's belief that he was building immortality was real. And all of it was erased as completely as if it had never existed. The story of Harbor Hill is the story of inherited wealth confronting its own limitations. Clarence inherited a fortune so large it seemed inexhaustible, but he never understood that capital without regeneration is just a very slow form of poverty. He spent at rates his father had never spent because his father understood where the money came from and what it cost to generate. Clarence only understood consumption. He thought wealth was about possession rather than production, about display rather than preservation. He consumed the fortune his father built the way he consumed everything else, with the assumption that his own pleasure and social advancement were adequate justifications for any expense. The operating costs alone should have warned him. $40,000 per day adjusted for inflation just to keep the house functioning. That is $14 million per year just for operations, not counting the initial construction costs or the art purchases or the lifestyle expenses beyond the house itself. No investment portfolio can sustain that level of spending indefinitely without active wealth generation to replace what is being consumed. Clarence was essentially eating his own seed corn, consuming the capital that should have been preserved to generate income, all to maintain a lifestyle and image that he believed was more important than financial sustainability. The tragedy is that Clarence was not stupid or lazy. He was educated, cultured, genuinely interested in art and beauty. In a different economic structure, his passion for collecting and supporting artists might have made him a celebrated patron rather than a cautionary tale. But he was trapped by the assumptions of his class and era that wealth once acquired was permanent, that managing it simply meant not doing anything too reckless, that the fortune his father built would last forever without the same ruthless focus on generation that had built it. He was wrong, and his wrongness consumed everything. Before we close, ask yourself, what are we building now that our grandchildren will find no trace of? The subdivision that replaced Harbor Hill is pleasant enough. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained lawns, houses with vinyl siding and two-car garages. The people who live there are solidly middle class, their lives defined by mortgage payments and commutes, and the ordinary concerns that occupy most people most of the time. They are living comfortable lives on land that once represented the absolute peak of American wealth and ambition, and they do not know, they do not think about it. Why would they? But sometimes, when construction crews dig to install new utility lines or build additions to existing houses, they find things. Pieces of carved limestone buried 3 feet down, fragments of Italian marble that were part of a terrace or a fountain, bits of decorative ironwork from gates or railings. These fragments surface occasionally, are examined briefly by workers who do not know their origin, and are discarded. The last physical traces of Harbor Hill emerging from the ground like archaeological artifacts from a lost civilization, which is exactly what they are. Catherine Dewar Mackay, who chose a surgeon over a palace, lived until 1930. She remarried and by all accounts was happier in her second marriage than she had been as mistress of Harbor Hill. She died relatively young, at 58, but she died having made a choice that was authentic rather than performative. She had rejected the cage, even knowing the rejection would cost her socially and financially. There is courage in that rejection that deserves acknowledgement, even as we recognize that she had options most women in her era did not have, that her choice was only possible because of the financial settlement her divorce had secured. Clarence's children sold off the remaining fragments of the estate over the following decades, the last pieces of the art collection, the remaining land that had not been subdivided, the mining stocks and cable company shares that had once generated millions annually and were now essentially worthless. By the 1950s, nothing remained of the Mackay fortune except memories and some family photographs and the trust funds that Clarence had established for his children before his wealth evaporated, trust funds that provided comfortable but not lavish incomes. The transformation from one of America's wealthiest families to comfortable middle wealth took exactly 2 generations. From John William Mackay digging silver from Nevada mountains to Clarence's grandchildren working ordinary professional jobs was a span of 70 years. This is the reality of generational wealth that estate planning attorneys understand, but that wealthy families resist acknowledging. Without active wealth generation, capital depletes. The operating costs of maintaining wealthy lifestyles exceed the returns from conservative investments. Inheritance taxes take their share. Divorces and family conflicts consume more. Market downturns and economic depressions destroy portions of what remains. The wealth that seems permanent in one generation becomes constrained in the next and vanishes in the third. The survival rate for family wealth beyond 3 generations is estimated at less than 10%. The Mackays were not unusual in their collapse. They were typical. Harbor Hill was extraordinary in its beauty and its scale, but it was ordinary in its fate. Dozens of similar estates were built along Long Island's Gold Coast during the same era. Most of them are gone now, demolished. subdivided, converted to schools or corporate headquarters or museums. The few that survive as private residences require owners wealthy enough and committed enough to absorb the crushing operating costs, and those owners are increasingly rare. The economic model that supported these estates, a handful of families controlling enormous wealth generated by industrial monopolies with minimal taxation and abundant cheap labor, no longer exists. The houses that remain are anachronisms, beautiful fossils from an extinct economic era. F. Scott Fitzgerald understood this even as the era was still happening. The Great Gatsby is not a celebration of wealth, but an autopsy of it, an examination of what wealth does to people and what people sacrifice to obtain it. Gatsby dies alone in his pool, shot by a man who blamed him for a death Gatsby did not cause. And no one comes to his funeral except the narrator and Gatsby's father, who still believes his son achieved something meaningful. The mansion that had hosted hundreds of party guests stands empty. The lights go dark, the music stops, and life continues for everyone except Gatsby, who had confused the performance of belonging with actual belonging and paid for that confusion with his life. Clarence Mackay died in his bedroom at Harbor Hill, surrounded by art he had purchased to prove his sophistication, in a house that had been designed to demonstrate his arrival but had become instead a monument to his failure. He died believing, perhaps, that Harbor Hill would survive him, that future generations would tour the house and study the art collection and remember the Mackay name as they remembered Vanderbilt and Morgan and Rockefeller. He was wrong. Within a decade of his death, Harbor Hill was rubble. Within 2 decades, suburban houses covered the land. Within 3 decades, almost no one except specialists remembered the house had ever existed. Giovanni Russo died on that same land 40 years earlier, crushed by limestone while building Clarence's dream, leaving behind a widow and children who never made it to America, who lived and died in Naples, while their husband and father's labor was being demolished on Long Island. The distance between their deaths in terms of wealth and power and social position was enormous. But the distance in terms of legacy is smaller than you would think. Both men are forgotten except by researchers who dig through archives looking for names and stories. Both men built something that was destroyed. Both men believed their labor meant something, and both were wrong in ways they never could have imagined. If this story changed how you understand wealth, legacy, or the monuments we build to outlast ourselves, if it made you question what actually endures, then you understand why complexity requires time and depth. That understanding is what makes the next difficult story possible. The real Great Gatsby mansion is gone, but the novel remains, the photographs remain, the cautionary tale remains, and the subdivisions remain, comfortable and ordinary, covering the ground where something extraordinary once stood. Perhaps that is the appropriate ending. Perhaps the transformation of a palace into ordinary houses where ordinary people live ordinary lives is exactly the correction history demands. Perhaps the demolition of Harbor Hill and its replacement with normal homes is proof that the Gilded Age excess was unsustainable, that we moved beyond it into something more democratic and reasonable. Or perhaps we just replaced one kind of monument with another. Clarence built a palace to prove his worth and left behind nothing. The people living in those subdivisions are building equity and retirement accounts and college funds, monuments in their own way, financial structures they believe will provide security and legacy, but capital markets can collapse again. Housing values can plummet. Economic depressions can destroy savings. As thoroughly as they destroyed Clarence's fortune, the form of the monument has changed, but the fundamental hope that we can build something that will outlast us and protect those we love remains exactly the same. And that hope is just as fragile now as it was when Clarence hired 600 workers to quarry limestone and build his dreams into a house that stood for 40 years before being ground into dust. Harbor Hill is gone. The workers are gone. Clarence is gone. Even the photographs are fading, stored in archives that fewer people visit each year. Soon, everyone who remembered the house even as a ruin will be gone too. And then Harbor Hill will exist only in specialized histories and in the symbolic space it occupies as the inspiration for Gatsby's mansion. Not a real place anymore. Just a story, just a warning, just another example of how the things we build to achieve permanence become instead proof of impermanence, how the monuments we create to transcend death become instead markers of how thoroughly death erases everything we cared about. What remains is the question that has no good answer. Why do we keep building? Why do we keep trying to create permanence when all the evidence suggests permanence is impossible? What makes us believe our monuments will survive when everyone else's monuments have fallen? Is it delusion? Is it hope? Is it the only way we know how to give our lives meaning in the face of certain erasure? Clarence Mackay built Harbor Hill. Giovanni Russo died building it. Catherine Dewar escaped from it. F. Scott Fitzgerald watched it and understood it. And now it is gone, leaving behind only questions and photographs and a few fragments of carved stone that surface occasionally when someone digs a new foundation in their backyard and wonders briefly what these pieces are before throwing them away. That is what remains of the greatest house in America. That is the legacy of $9 billion in silver and $250 million in construction and 40 years of believing beauty could be permanent, a few broken pieces of stone that mean nothing to the people who find them, and a novel about how wealth corrupts everything it touches, including the people who possess it, and especially the people who build their identities around possessing it. The real Great Gatsby mansion is gone, but we are still building new ones, still believing our monuments will last, still convinced that this time will be different, and history watches and waits to prove us wrong again. Because history always wins, the houses fall, the fortunes evaporate, the names are forgotten, and new houses rise where old palaces stood, occupied by people who do not know and do not care what came before, living their lives on top of other people's demolished dreams.